Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we'll continue the coverage of the Errata for 2024 rules. This is going to contain both the Dungeon Master's Guide, which has only a couple things, as well as a lot of things that were changed within the Monster Manual. I definitely appreciate at least one of you letting me know that there is Errata for both the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. I didn't scroll down when I was reading the notes. I just assumed that it would be all in one PDF, but I guess I was wrong on that one. So I've taken the time to kind of come through that and see what it's about. Try to divine some of the reasoning that would be behind those changes. Some of them are more obvious, some of them aren't. Very similar to what we saw in my last video for the Player's Handbook Errata changes. So we already know what this is about. Let's just go ahead and get started. But before we actually get started with the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, I do want to cover the more individual stat block updates to the Player's Handbook. I did cover in my last video where in the Player's Handbook, the stat blocks in the Appendix B, the errata for them is that they were updated to the Monster Manual 2024 versions of those stat blocks. I kind of hand-waved over that, assuming that they were mostly formatting changes, but they're actually pretty noticeable mechanical changes as well. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So for our Player's Handbook stat block updates, I'm going to credit this to Orange Traz. This is on the r/1DND subreddit. Definitely happy that they were able to put that together so I didn't have to take the time to do it. This first group here is going to be creatures that have attacks or features that have additional effects such as pushing or knocking prone. Many of them have had a size restriction either made even more restrictive or a size restriction added where one wasn't there before. I'm not going to take the time to list all of them here. You can pause to read, but we can see large was reduced to medium, huge to large. The elephant had a limit put on their feature as well. Moving on to the next group, we have the octopus here and their compression feature. The word squeezing was changed to expending extra movement to do so. The panther had multiple changes. Basically, its dexterity was increased by 1 up to 16 from 15. And then all the stats that are based on dexterity were upgraded as well. And then it had its multi-attack, pounce, and prowl features removed. It has a new action called Rend, which is basically just a singular attack, and a new bonus action called Nimble Escape that allows it to disengage or hide as a bonus action. This isn't quite as big of a nerf as it seems like. The multi-attack was just a single attack plus the prowl feature, so it was only ever making one attack and then taking that extra action. It can still basically do that. It just makes one attack as its action, and then using its bonus action, it can either disengage or hide. The only real nerf is that prowl was both a disengage and a hide in the same action, so there's a small nerf there. The pounce was just the other name for their attack. It did have a rider where it said if they had advantage on the attack, which would of course they could get from hiding, that it did slightly more damage. However, the new action, the Rend attack, did slightly more base damage than the old pounce attack did. The pseudo dragon, its sting, its damage was decreased from 2d4 plus 2. It is now just 2d4. The pseudo dragon also has another update to its stat block as well, but that was mentioned in the actual errata for the Monster Manual, so we'll take a look at that when we get to that. The skeleton had a couple changes. Its AC was increased from 13 to 14. In its languages, it used to have the languages it knew in life. It now has common plus one other language. And then finishing these ones off, we have the tiger. The tiger had very similar changes to the panther, but instead of its dexterity being increased, its health pool was increased a little bit. Again, it had the multi-attack, pounce, and prowl removed. It has a new action that deals some damage. It can knock a larger or smaller creature prone, and then has the nimble escape, being able to disengage or hide as a bonus action. And then similarly, the zombie compared to the skeleton, languages changed to the languages it knew in life, is now common plus one other language. And then the slam had its damage increased very slightly by 1 damage die size. So those are all the updates to the stat blocks in the Player's Handbook, or at least those that this user has come through so far. I would assume that they've done a pretty thorough job because this was pretty thorough already. But if you know of any others, feel free to mention them down in the comments. So with that aside, let's just go ahead and jump to the errata in the DMG. Starting with a rule that is in the DM's toolbox. This is a section under the chasing rules. This is in the dashing subheading. It used to say that a chase participant can take the dash action a number of times equal to 3 plus its constitution modifier, minimum of once. Each additional dash action during the chase requires a creature to succeed on a DC 10 constitution saving throw at the end of its turn or gain 1 exhaustion level. A participant drops out of the chase if its speed is 0. So the main thing that has been errated here is that last sentence. There's a change to that last sentence plus 1 additional sentence on the end. So this now says that a participant drops out of the chase if it has 5 exhaustion levels, and then additionally a creature can remove the exhaustion levels it gained during the chase by finishing a short rest. So however many levels of exhaustion you get during a chase, during our next short rest, you can just get rid of all of them. That is opposed to the normal rule where you have to finish a long rest just to get rid of 1 exhaustion level. So why would a change like this be necessary? Well, for one, the 2014 exhaustion rules reduced a creature speed to 0 at level 5. This is opposed to the 2024 exhaustion rules where it reduces a creature speed by 5 times the exhaustion level. So at 5 levels of exhaustion, you have a speed reduction of 25, which is not enough to reduce a normal player's speed to 0, and not even enough to get most creatures creature's speed to 0. So basically under these rules, under the new 2024 rules, in a chase you could literally run yourself to death because you still outright die at 6 levels of exhaustion. This also does have another effect where it prevents any shenanigans where if you drop a creature's speed to 0 using a different feature, whether it be like Sentinel or Rhymes Binding Ice if they're within range, you can't just force people out of a chase by doing that. Moving on to the second and only other errata for the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a part in the Creating Adventures where it talks about the random treasures that you could find in a horde. We're looking at the third line here where it says for a creature of CR 11 through 16, their monetary treasure would be 8d8 plus 10,000 or 36,000 gold points. Of course, if you're quick at doing math or you can kind of realize that something is a little off there, this is supposed to be 8d8 times 1,000 or 36,000 gold points. Why did they do this? Of course, this is just a typo. The math didn't even work out in the original. They just clearly put on an extra 0 there. So if you have 8d8 times 1,000, that's an average of 4.5 times 8, which is 36. So 36 times 1,000 is 36,000. Just one extra digit there on that multiplier. That is all the Dungeon Master's Guide changes. Let's go ahead and jump straight into the Monster Manual. Starting with changes to spellcasting. So I grouped some of these creatures together. So mini creatures with a spellcasting feature that said they had 1 per day but had multiple spells in that tier now say 1 per day each, such as you see Fireball and Scrying. So previously with this wording they would have only either 1 Fireball or 1 Scrying per day. If they did one they couldn't do the other. Now they can do 1 of them each per day. The affected creatures would be the Ancient Red Dragon, the Death Knight, the Death Knight Aspirant, the Githyanki Warrior, and the Green Slod. So then why was this needed? Well, for consistency / it's a typo, many creatures with multiple spells in the same tier in the Monster Manual already have this sort of wording. And then creatures with only 1 spell, such as like it says once per day Fireball, they don't need that each text. Moving on to some ability score changes. So the Ancient White Dragon had their charisma buffed from 14 to 18, and then the Swarm of Lemures had their dexterity reduced from 8 to 7. This was actually just a typo. All of the ability score bonuses and any like save DCs or anything else that was based on those features already had the correct number. They just had the wrong number in the ability score slot. Moving on to creatures that had changes to their armor class, we're going to start with the Arcanoloth. They had an armor class of 17. They now have an armor class of 18. The Cultist Hierophant in the spellcasting feature, it had mage armor and then it said included in AC, which is not unusual for monsters that rely on mage armor for their armor class, but they removed that from their spread list. It is no longer considered part of their armor class. However, why would they do that? Well, for the Arcanoloth, in 2014, the Arcanoloth was listed as having natural armor. Presumably that's still true, but so this is presumably just a direct buff. There's no way to calculate natural armor. But for the Cultist Hierophant, they have an equipment part of their stat block that says that they have a breastplate. So their armor class already matches a breastplate plus their dexterity. So the whole idea of them having mage armor is kind of redundant, other than being able to cast it on other people, but they just kind of removed it from the stat block entirely. Moving on to a creature that had its hit points adjusted, we're going to move on to the Baylor. It used to have 300 hit points. This is 24d12 plus 144. It now has 287 hit points. This is 23d12 plus 138. Why was this one needed? It's actually kind of unclear. The math works out based on like the average of a d12 times 23 plus their con modifier times 23. That all still works out. It still has more hit points than the 2014 version. There's never really been guidance, even in the old Monster Manual and even in the old Dungeon Master's Guide, about how many hit dice a monster should have, other than basically however many you want based on that table of how to create a monster based on the stats that they should have per CR. But if they're making these sort of very, very small adjustments, like giving the Arcanoloth a +1 natural armor AC and then a very small adjustment here to the Baylor, they obviously have some sort of formula that they use to calculate these things such that they would have caught. I couldn't even call them mistakes because, again, you can just give a creature however many hit points you want. I would really love if, like, whatever secrets Wizards of the Coast has to design their monsters and adjust their hit points, if they would, like, released whatever formula or algorithm that they use. But that is what it is. So moving on, let's move on to creatures that had adjustments to their initiative. Starting with Galeb Dur, I guess that's how I'm going to pronounce that. It had an initiative of +2 with an initiative score of 17. This was now dropped to +2 with an initiative score of 12. The Performer Legend had an initiative of 10 + 20. It now has an initiative of 9 + 19. Performer Maestro had +8 and an 18 initiative score. It is now a 7 and a 17 initiative score. And then the Violet Fungus had a -5 initiative with a 10 initiative score, which is now a -5 with a 5 initiative score. So why was this necessary? For the Gale of Dur, the initiative score is supposed to be 10 plus initiative, so it's 10 plus 2. It should be 12, so that was just a typo. The Performer Legend, their proficiency bonus is a +4. Their dex is a +5 for a total of +9, so they just had a miscalculation there. Same for the Maestro. There's a proficiency of +3, a dex of +4 for a total of 7, so they had to make a slight adjustment there. And then for the Violet Fungus, similar to Gale of Dur, they just had the wrong calculation for the initiative score. Then we're going to move on to creatures that had their attack bonus adjusted. So we're looking at the Giant Frog with its Bite and the Priest with its Radiant Flame. These were necessary because the Giant Frog had a strength +1, proficiency is +2. This is supposed to be a +3 attack bonus, not a +4. Similarly, the Priest has a +3 to Wisdom and a +2 to their proficiency for a total of +5, so it always should have been a +5. Next, we're going to look at creatures who have had changes to their weapon attacks. So now we're looking at the Cyclops Sentry. They had a multi-attack and a Great Club attack where the words Great Club were replaced with Stone Club. The Fomorian similarly had the exact same change. And then the Goblin Boss had its shortbow range changed from 80 to 230 feet to a shortbow range of 80 to 320 feet. So why would something like this be necessary? Well, for one, the Cyclops Sentry and Fomorian, one, I guess it could be flavor, but two, I think more accurately, this decouples the weapon damage of that attack from the oversized weapon rules, which don't exist in the new Dungeon Master's Guide, but they still exist in the old Dungeon Master's Guide. And I'm referring to specifically these rules here. Basically, for every size larger than medium that a creature is, you multiply by 2 for large, 3 for huge, 4 for gargantuan if they're using a weapon of that size. So the Great Club, for example, is a 1d8 weapon damage for a medium creature. The Fomorian using a Great Club, being a huge creature, should be doing 3d8 with a Great Club. However, the attack in the Monster Manual does 48 damage plus their strength. And then similarly for the Cyclops Sentry, their Great Club attack did 3d6 plus their strength damage instead of being 3d8 like it should, because a Great Club is a d8. So by calling it a Stone Club, they no longer need to sort of tie themselves to these rules for oversized weapons because it's no longer based on the Great Club. And then for the Goblin Boss, they simply had the numbers transposed on the long range of the short bow. It is supposed to be 320 feet on the long range, so they just had the right numbers put in the wrong place. There is one monster who had alterations to their senses. This would be the Ice Devil. It originally had blind sight to 60 feet that was unimpeded by magical darkness, and then dark vision of 120 feet, and then a passive perception of 17. It now has blind sight up to 120 feet and a passive perception of 17. So why was this one needed? Well, one, the old description was just super messy. The Devil Sight parenthetical, where it says unimpeded by magical darkness, that is supposed to come after the dark vision entry. It doesn't come before it. If you look at other devils that have the Devil Sight feature like this, that is how it is organized. This one makes it look like it's blind sight that's being unimpeded by magical darkness. So what they did instead is just remove that dark vision and Devil Sight parenthetical overall and just extend the range of their blind sight, because it's effectively the same thing. And it's also just generally a small buff because now they have blind sight out to 120 feet. So now we're going to go on to specific features of different creatures that had changes as well. Starting with our Carrion Crawler, this one has a feature called Paralyzing Tentacles. This one was a dexterity saving throw. This is now a constitution saving throw. The reason this one was necessary is because the paralysis is based on a saving throw against being poisoned, and poisoned saving throws are traditionally constitution saving throws, not dexterity. Next, we have the Cloaker. This has an attach feature. Within the description of that feature, it referred to bite attacks. All references to the bite attacks have been changed to attach attacks. The reason for this one is that the Cloaker doesn't have a bite attack in 2024. This was another holdover sort of copy paste from the 2014 Monster Manual that they didn't quite catch before release. Next creature would be the Kraken's Fling ability. This now says that it can fling large or smaller creatures, whereas previously it just said it can fling large creatures, which meant that it technically couldn't fling medium, small, or tiny creatures. Obviously this one has changed just for practicality. Of course it can fling creatures that are smaller than large. That would be ridiculous for it not to be able to do that. And now for the change in the Monster Manual that I think most people are talking about, we have the Pseudo Dragon. This one used to say that a creature poisoned by the sting is unconscious if it fails the DC by 5 or more, and another creature could wake them from any distance just using their actions, such as like shouting, "Hey, get the heck up." But now with the errata, this has been changed to a creature poisoned by the sting is unconscious while poisoned this way. You no longer need to fail the saving throw by 5 or more. Additionally, another creature can only wake them if they are within 5 feet of the unconscious creature and then use their action to wake them. So why was this one necessary? I'm actually unsure. I don't know if this is the only existence of a fail by 5 or more rider on a saving throw within the Monster Manual. If you know of any others, definitely let me know down in the comments, but I think they might have just changed their mind of not wanting that sort of mechanic within the rules at least. This does buff Pact of the Chain Warlocks against enemies that aren't immune to poison, which again, within the Monster Manual aren't a lot of them, but also again, when you are fighting creatures, you're typically fighting a lot of the same creatures, and if all of those creatures aren't immune to poison, then you can spread this all over the place. but I feel like that buff is just happenstance. I don't believe that was the reason for the change to this one. But of course, if you think that makes Pact of the Chain overpowered, I would urge you to think about this from the DM perspective, because if you just suddenly find yourself in a room full of pseudo dragons, that kind of makes them a TPK machine. Because even though it's just a DC 12 Constitution save, if you don't have proficiency in Constitution, or even just insane stats in your Constitution, even a level 20 character is going to fail this saving throw eventually. And if that combat is full of pseudo dragons and then creatures that can crit for a heck of a lot of damage, this is basically a TPK enabler. So I imagine many people are excited about trying to use this now as the Pact of the Chain Warlock, and I don't even know that it's that big of a buff to the Pact of the Chain Warlock. I think between the ways that the Pact of the Chain and the investment of the Chainmaster features work with the way that the Sting feature works now in 2024, it isn't quite the same combo that it used to be, but at least in the vacuum, it's still very powerful. So I might have to dig into Pact of the Chain and their familiars and what they can do now, and how much better or worse Pact of the Chain is now in 2024. But that could be a whole video on its own. So then moving on to the last creature, we have the Swarm of Lemirs. We saw this one once before with a change to its initiative score. This one had some text that was updated as well for their Swarm feature. It previously used to say that it can move through an opening large enough for a large creature. It now says that it can move through an opening large enough for a medium creature. Why was this one necessary? Well, because the Swarm of Lemirs is a large swarm of medium creatures, so obviously it can move through a large space. But generally the idea is that swarms can fit through a space that is designed for a creature one size smaller without being hampered in any ways with like squeezing rules and the like. So that's everything for the errata for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. I really haven't actually spent a whole lot of time in the Dungeon Master's Guide and in the Monster Manual really delving into the minutia of the rules. So I don't know if there's anything that wasn't in the errata that I felt like should be. I do generally feel like also that there should be more limitations around how far you can push yourself. The new exhaustion rules, how like you can't push yourself into exhaustion by dashing so much in a chase, but if you're in a forced march, you can still march yourself to death. Again, the whole point of the 2014 exhaustion, the level 5 reducing your speed to 0, I feel like a big reason for that was so that you couldn't march yourself to death or dash yourself to death or do whatever. Like you couldn't move yourself to death. You would eventually just stop moving and have to be carried or whatever. You could of course still die from, starvation if you're left behind, whatever, but you couldn't march yourself to death. That existed as a stopgap in the 2014 exhaustion rules. I feel like Wizards of the Coast needs to look more in the rules as to where things like that can happen. There is a section in Rime of the Frost Maiden where a player can now technically exhaust themselves to death. There are certainly other things that I wish were just in the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, but that isn't really what errata is for. These aren't mistakes on the content that is already there. This is just content that I feel like was missing. I will also say that I'm generally just kind of disappointed at the sweeping changes to the stat blocks that are in the player's handbook. Not that there's anything wrong with these stat blocks that are currently in the older version of the player's handbook. It's just that those are all now out of date. I feel like they definitely should have had all of this stuff on lock before they, I don't mind the staggered release, but we shouldn't be making sweeping changes to the stat blocks that are in the player's handbook based on changes that happened later in the Monster Manual. Because again, these are supposed to be things that are the 3 core rule books. I really feel like they should have been done working on them at the same time and then just do a staggered release and not release the player's handbook, finish working on this one, release the Dungeon Master's Guide, finish working on this one, release the Monster Manual. Don't know how that happened. Feels a bit unprofessional. It's just one thing to be simply, correcting like typographical errors and small things like that, but it's another to just make sweeping format changes. Let me know what you think about any of these changes. If you're a DM, is there anything that you think they should have corrected in the Dungeon Master's Guide? If you have spent a lot of time peering through the different Monster Manual stat blocks, is there anything that you caught that you think that they didn't pick up on? Definitely let me know all that down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you're a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.